On March 1st, 2011, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gisela Daoud heard her phone ringing. An unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a police officer from the city of Valence, asking if she was the mother of Samira Ben Saad. She answered yes. Gisela couldn't understand why the police were looking for her 20-year-old daughter, Samira. She hadn't seen her for 3 days. The woman demanded an explanation of what was happening, but the police response did not calm her at all. The caller stated that they were searching for Samira because her boyfriend, 22-year-old Maël Combier, had gone missing. The police had discovered that the young couple had been dating for 8 months. However, Gisela knew nothing about the guy. Samira and Maël had met at a party. Samira Ben Saad was a very beautiful woman who was aware of her attractiveness. She wanted to become a model and loved posing for photographs. Maël, in turn, was also a very nice and pleasant young man. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them, and they started seeing each other. However, on February 28, 2011, at 9:45 p.m., Maël's boss from the construction company contacted the police. He was worried because he hadn't heard from his employee for 3 days. On Saturday morning, the guy came to work and then his phone rang. He quickly got up and left without any explanation, and no one had seen him since. On Monday morning, his boss was surprised that he still hadn't shown up. They considered him a punctual and responsible employee, and it was the first time he didn't come to work. His boss found out that Maël wasn't answering calls from colleagues and friends, so he decided to contact the police. First, the police went to the guy's home in the city center of Valence, but it yielded no results because no one answered the doorbell. His car was not at the house either. On the same evening, the police talked to Maël's mother. She hadn't received any news from her son for 3 days and added that during their last meeting, he had behaved very unusually, being extremely emotional and tense. The woman mentioned that her son hugged and kissed her and said he loved her, something he had never done before. The details uncovered by the investigators seemed very suspicious. Maël and Samira disappeared on the same day without explaining anything to anyone and had not contacted their families for 3 days. It couldn't be a coincidence. One clue came from examining their phones. The investigators found out that Samira and Maël didn't just leave at the same time, but they left together in Maël's car. The phone pings revealed that on Saturday, in the middle of the day, they headed to Nice, and in the evening, they checked into a luxury hotel on the promenade. The investigators contacted the hotel and learned that there were surveillance cameras capturing 2 guys and a woman. The description perfectly matched Samira and Maël. They left Nice on Sunday morning and arrived in Livorno, 400 kilometers east of the border between France and Italy, by the evening. The young couple was clearly heading further into Italy, and the French police sought assistance from their Italian colleagues. Maël had booked a room in a prestigious hotel in Livorno. The hotel staff confirmed that a guy and a woman matching the description of the missing couple had stayed with them. So, Saturday evening was spent in Nice, and the next day they headed to Livorno. Everything indicated that Samira and Maël had embarked on a spontaneous romantic journey, especially considering that the Riviera was conducive to such adventures. The detectives believed that the young couple would soon return home together, and they had no reason to doubt this theory, especially since Samira's mother received a message from her daughter stating that she had left but there was no need to worry because she would return soon. It seemed like it should have been another confirmation that everything was fine with the young couple, but Gisela was certain that her daughter would never disappear just by impulsively leaving for a trip. Samira was a responsible woman who never missed work. There was another detail that troubled Gisela. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who loved being photographed and never left the house without meticulously applied makeup, styled hair, and carefully chosen clothes, could go away for several days with a young man without taking any belongings with her. She was also puzzled by the fact that Samira sent an SMS. The thing is, she would usually just call her mother. They were close and could talk for hours, so receiving a text message didn't calm her down. Instead, it only worried her even more. The next news about the case came from the city of Imperia, located in northern Italy, approximately 80 kilometers from Nice. On Monday, March 3, 2011, Massimo Bessone was on his way to work when he turned onto a small street to take a shortcut. Along the road, he noticed something strange. At first, he thought he saw a mannequin, but when he opened the door, he realized it was a woman. Massimo shouted something but received no response. However, the woman was clearly moving. He quickly called for an ambulance. Italian police determined that she was the missing French woman. Someone had shot her in the back of the head, and the bullet had lodged in her skull. The theory of a romantic trip could now be discarded. The French police were perplexed. Initially, it was a case of suspicious disappearance. Then they thought it was a love-related escape, but now they were dealing with a girl who had been wounded in an attempted murder. Samira was alive but in critical condition. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and her mother was informed. When Gazella arrived at the hospital, she didn't even recognize her own daughter at first. It's difficult to describe the sight. Samira's head was shaved bald, and she resembled a 9-year-old child. The woman refused to believe that her daughter ended up in Italy with a bullet in her head. The doctors told the mother that there was little hope since the bullet was lodged in her daughter's skull. But Gazella didn't want to accept that and arranged for Samira to be transported to a hospital in Marseille. There, a surgeon informed her directly that he would perform the operation but wouldn't provide false hope. Even if the patient survived, she would never fully recover. Samira underwent a 10-hour operation. Although she made it through the surgery, when she opened her eyes, she didn't recognize anyone and couldn't speak. She had to relearn everything like a young child. While Samira couldn't tell anything about what happened in Italy, the police had to search for the culprit without her testimony. Many indications pointed to the crime being planned. She was found lying on the side of the road near a landfill, and the Italian police couldn't find any of her belongings. There was no purse, no phone, no passport. This indicated that the perpetrator wanted her to remain unidentified. However, the investigators had a lead. The last person Samira was seen with was her boyfriend, Maël Combier. The police believed that Maël crossed the border into Italy to commit the crime and then fled. However, he made a mistake by using his bank card in France after Samira was found. He used it at a first-class hotel in Les Tourrex, just 35 kilometers from his apartment in Valence. Surveillance cameras showed that Maël had returned to France a day earlier. But if he was innocent, why didn't he go home to his family? Instead, he stayed in a hotel just a few kilometers away. Soon, he made another mistake. Investigators discovered that he had used Samira's credit card. In other words, the young couple embarked on a spontaneous trip to another country where the woman nearly died, and Maël stayed in a hotel and used her card. Everything confirmed the police's worst suspicions. To search for a motive, the detective spoke with the family and friends of the young man. It became clear that Samira and Maël's relationship was far from perfect. Samira was a very beautiful woman, and many men showed interest in her, which bothered Maël. Their arguments often escalated into physical violence. Maël could slap Samira in front of their friends, and there was even an incident where he extinguished a cigarette on her. Obviously, he couldn't be considered a very stable person, but the question of the motive remained open. Did Maël act in a fit of rage, or was everything planned in advance? All their friends knew that Samira was infatuated with Maël despite his behavior. However, she recently found out that her boyfriend was married. He had gotten married to his girlfriend at the age of 18 and frequently cheated on her. Samira was far from being his only mistress. She was angered by the revelation but didn't break up with him because she believed Maël's claim that they were in the process of divorce and living separately. Upon discovering this, the investigator went to Maël's home. But as soon as he entered, he realized that Samira was mistaken and the husband and wife were clearly living together. Furthermore, Maël was soon to become a father. The apartment had 17 ultrasound photos with the name Combier written on them. It was evident that Maël, his wife, and Samira were involved in a love triangle, and one of them was destined to disappear. It was necessary to find Maël, and it turned out to be much easier than the police had anticipated. Maël Combier surrendered himself 5 days after the disappearance, appearing at the Valence police station on March 4th. This was an incredible stroke of luck for the investigation. Maël not only came to the station voluntarily but also directly confessed that he was the one who shot Samira. He then proceeded to recount what had happened. The young man claimed that Samira was just an acquaintance with whom he could spend pleasant time. Their relationship had no future, and she knew it. Maël explained that their romance had come to an end, but Samira couldn't accept it. She didn't give him a moment's peace, constantly calling him and sometimes dialing his number 150 times in a single day. He showed the investigator his phone, which displayed evidence that Samira had called him approximately 1,000 times in a month. Maël's words confirmed that Samira's behavior could be classified as stalking. But could this be considered a justification for shooting her? Soon, the situation escalated to the point where the young man feared for his life. He recounted what happened on the Friday evening before their departure to Italy. Samira confronted him in a nightclub while he was kissing another woman. She stormed out of the club, scratched his car with her key, and they began arguing, which escalated into a fight with Samira's cousins. This incident terrified Maël because they claimed to have weapons and threatened to kill him. Maël was in a panic. He quickly got into his car and left the nightclub, deciding that he needed to come up with a way to protect himself in the future. The idea of acquiring a weapon for his own defense crossed his mind. The next day, when he received the call, he impulsively left and went to buy a revolver. However, all of this still didn't explain why he shot Samira. Maël explains that he didn't go to Italy to kill her or commit any other terrible act. He simply wanted to put an end to their troubled relationship. He drove Samira to Italy to calm down their heated emotions and explain everything to her. But things didn't go as planned. They argued again in the car, and Maël got out. Samira followed him. According to Maël, he grabbed the weapon with the intention of scaring her but had no intention to shoot. However, the revolver went off accidentally. Afterward, he left her lying on the ground, got back into the car, and drove away. When asked why he didn't call for an ambulance, he said he was scared when she fell. He went into hiding for several days because he didn't know what to do. The rest of the story was already known to the police. Overall, the man claims that he was the victim of his obsessive lover's pursuit, and what happened in Italy was an accident. He was arrested for attempted murder, but his explanation didn't fully convince the police. Some pieces didn't fit together. Why would someone travel to another country and stay in a luxury hotel just to end a relationship? Why did he take all her personal belongings and then use her credit card? And who sent the message to Samira's mother from her daughter's phone? The investigator had no doubt that the young man was lying, but it was difficult to prove without Samira's testimony. Fortunately, over time and with therapy, Samira was able to provide her testimony. At first, with a weak voice and very slowly, Samira began to speak. On October 11, 2011, 8 months after the attack, she recounted her version of events. Samira's words contradicted the claims of her former lover. He came to her home, stating that they needed to talk. She didn't want to, but he insisted, so she relented. Maël invited her for a weekend getaway. She asked where he wanted to go, and he replied, Spain. This didn't sit well with her, so he took her to Nice instead, and from there, they went to Italy. After 2 days of leisure, on the 3rd day of the trip, Maël unexpectedly veered off the road. When asked why he turned onto a road leading to a landfill, he reassured her not to worry because he simply needed to dispose of something. Maël stopped the car and got out. He opened the passenger side door for her to exit and retrieved a revolver. Pointing it at her, he declared that she would die. "Shoot if you're a man," she exclaimed, and he fired the gun. On February 7, 2012, a year after the attack on Samira, forensic experts found the revolver, and this discovery completely refuted Maël's claims. According to his version, the gun in his hand unexpectedly went off. However, ballistic analysis showed that such an event could not have occurred. The expert explained that before firing, the shooter needs to carefully prepare, pull the trigger back and then shoot, which involves two distinct actions. You cannot simply wave your hand for the revolver to fire. Furthermore, to pull the trigger of the revolver backward, one needs to hold the weapon with one hand and apply significant force to accomplish the action with the other hand. Accidentally firing such a firearm was utterly impossible. Maël Combier lied. He wanted to kill Samira, and after several months of investigation, detectives were able to reconstruct the plan that the murderer had conceived. On February 26, 2011, at 9 a.m., Maël left work. He was determined to avoid a repeat of the previous night's scene at all costs, so he purchased a weapon. Heading to the woods, he tested it, loaded it, pulled the trigger, and fired. He had planned everything. After a romantic weekend in Italy, Samira was supposed to disappear on the other side of the border. Italy served as the perfect country to commit the crime since he had no connections there. Driving off the road, Maël pulled the woman out of the car, declared he would kill her, and shot her. Then he took her belongings to prevent her identification. Returning to France, Maël attempted to mislead the police by sending an SMS to Samira's mother. Everyone was supposed to believe that the woman had gone on a trip and was still alive. The guy believed he had committed the perfect crime and was confident that he would never be caught. Imagine his surprise when he discovered that his victim had survived. While the police were searching for him, he spent 5 days hiding near his hometown, contemplating his next actions. He lacked the means and useful connections to escape, so he devised a new strategy for self-defense. Maël Combier decided to go to the police and present his version of events. On February 10, 2014, the trial of Maël began in the city of Valence. The trial was a real ordeal for the victim and her family. To their immense surprise, Maël did not deviate from his version of events. He insisted that he was the victim in this case, and Samira had been harassing him, and everything that happened in Italy was an unfortunate accident. His friends stated that he had never been an aggressive person and purchased the revolver out of fear after threats from Samira's cousins, who had threatened to destroy his apartment, car, and kill Maël himself. He hid nothing and went on a trip to Italy in his own car, taking his phone with him. He simply wanted to take the woman on a trip to calm her down, as he was emotionally exhausted from Samira's constant call. It is also worth noting that Maël conducted himself with exaggerated politeness and respect during the trial, effortlessly charming the jury, and his strategy paid off. He was sentenced to 13 years of imprisonment. The lenient sentence made many wonder if there was a connection between Maël's behavior in court and the relatively short duration of the sentence chosen by the jury. After all, people often associate criminals with unpleasant personalities, and it is difficult for them to convict a charming young man with excellent manners. Samira considers this punishment too lenient, as by the time he turns 40, he will be a free man, able to live a normal life, while she will forever remain bound to a wheelchair simply because she loved a man who decided to kill her. The surgeon explained that during 1 year of therapy, Samira regained 80% of her abilities, after which the effectiveness of rehabilitation sharply declined, leaving her dependent on the help of others for the rest of her life. She admits that she was willing to do anything for love, and this is how he repaid her.
The criminal world of Liverpool was seriously shaken. 3 guys broke into a father and son's house and made off with a 30-kilogram stash of prohibited substances. The robbery sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. The gang that owned the stolen batch was once considered untouchable. A secret informant reported that the guys who lost goods worth £1 million were at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy. No one could believe that someone would dare to steal from them. Police managed to crack the case by gaining access to their phones, and in May 2022, some of them found themselves behind bars. However, Liverpool's gangs were still furious and tried to get to anyone they believed was involved in the heist. Rumors circulated that 35-year-old Joseph Nee had been gathering information for them. Joseph Nee had only recently been released from prison, where he served time for drug distribution and robbery. He was granted early release and was required to comply with parole conditions. Nee was part of a gang that trafficked Class A controlled substances into Liverpool, the most dangerous of them all. Joseph wasn't considered the most popular guy even within his criminal circle, and some had even targeted him before because even his own associates viewed him as an informant and a snitch. On August 22, 2022, Joseph and his friends gathered at a mutual acquaintance's house to watch a football match between Liverpool and United. The game ended at 21:52, and shortly after, Joseph left the house with one of his friends, Paul Abraham. Later, Paul would recount that they were simply walking down the street when, at 21:59, they heard 3 loud pops. Of course, they had heard such sounds before and instantly recognized them as gunshots. The men started running. The shooter circled around and began firing at the men from behind at close range. The attacker was very close to his target and, of course, knew how to handle a firearm. As a result, the bullet struck Joseph in the upper abdomen, and he fell immediately. Paul Abraham leaped over his fallen wounded friend and sprinted towards the park gates. It might not have been the noblest behavior towards a friend, but perhaps he knew that it wasn't worth risking his life for Joseph. At that moment, the armed man was in a perfect position, unlike his victim. Joseph lay unarmed, wounded and defenseless on the ground, while the stranger, dressed in black and wearing a balaclava, confidently approached him, holding a 9mm pistol. Joseph begged for mercy, but the stranger paid no attention to his pleas and coldly squeezed the trigger. The shot could only have been lethal, but obviously the universe was on Joseph's side at that moment. As they say, the gun jammed and it didn't fire. Joseph didn't miss this chance to jump up and, despite his wound, run away. Surprisingly, the shooter was prepared for any turn of events. He calmly retrieved 2 weapons, a revolver, and continued the pursuit, never ceasing to fire. Meanwhile, Joseph was running in the direction of King's Hit Avenue, an ordinary street where ordinary families lived. This was the home of 46-year-old Cheryl Corbell and her 3 children, Chloe, Ryan, and their younger sister, 9-year-old Olivia, who everyone called Liv. Of course, all the residents on the street who were at home heard that there was some commotion outside. Some realized that these were gunshots, while others were puzzled about what was happening. Among them was Cheryl. The woman opened the door and looked out onto the street, as many would have done in her place. However, Joseph noticed the light in the partially open door, and he ran as fast as he could toward Cheryl's house. The woman was horrified to see an injured man approaching her, followed by an armed man in a mask. Quickly assessing the situation and realizing that it was not worth getting involved in the gang's altercation, she rushed back into the house and tried to slam the door. Unfortunately, the dropped latch prevented her from doing so. Joseph, desperate to escape and knowing that his time was running out because his pursuer was about to catch up with him, pounded on the door, begging the homeowner for help. Cheryl had already realized that these were some criminal gang troubles, and being a Liverpool resident, she understood that she and her family would face trouble if she got involved in something like this. So, she ordered the man to leave. She must have felt sorry for the wounded man, but her desire to protect her own children outweighed everything else. However, Joseph had no intention of leaving. He threw himself against the door with all his weight, breaking inside, knowing that this would bring enormous problems to the family. The man burst inside and collapsed on the floor, weakened from the chase and the gunshot wound. But the pursuer didn't back down. He saw Joseph Nee enter the house. Another person might have thought that there would always be another day, another opportunity to reach the target. But the shooter had no intention of giving up. He had a mission to accomplish, regardless of who he harmed. The commotion near the front door of the house, which had now shifted into the hallway, was accompanied by noise. Chloe, Ryan, and Olivia were sleeping, but they woke up due to the loud sounds. Ryan recalls that he was in his room when he heard 3 loud noises followed by quick footsteps. It was his younger sister, Olivia, running downstairs crying out, "Mom, I'm scared!" Ryan also came out of his room but stayed at the top of the stairs, watching in bewilderment as chaos unfolded below. He looked down and wondered who this man lying in the hallway was. He saw his mother trying to close the door, and his younger sister stood just a few steps away from the front door. Olivia wanted to be closer to her mother. She went down to her, crying, "Mom, I'm scared! Mom, I'm scared!" The assailant at this moment could not ignore the child's cries. He knew that Joseph Nee had burst into the home of an ordinary family with no connection to their disputes. He saw Cheryl trying to eject the stranger from the house, saw Joseph attempting to get inside, and heard Olivia's cries. However, none of this mattered to him because he simply started shooting through the gap in the door without thinking about where the bullets might hit. A bullet struck Cheryl, entering her right hand. But even though she was in pain, she continued to battle with the door. Joseph, at this moment, regained his senses to the point where he began to help her. He shouted at her to call the police because the shooter was still trying to force his way in. The shooter managed to push his hand with the revolver through the gap in the door. While Joseph began to plead with him to stop again, Cheryl jammed the door, including his hand with the weapon, before he began shooting once more. A bullet hit the door frame. Finally, the shooter decided he had spent too much time and retreated. Cheryl was able to breathe a sigh of relief, stopped struggling with the door, and rushed to comfort her daughter. She wasn't concerned about her own wound. The most important thing was to hug Olivia and tell her that everything would be okay, that no one would harm her now. Cheryl noticed that there was a lot of blood on Olivia's pajamas and thought that her wound on her arm was bleeding heavily. But then she lifted her daughter's shirt and realized that it wasn't her blood. Olivia had been shot. The same bullet that had injured Cheryl had gone through her right hand and into Olivia's chest. Olivia was gasping for air. Her mother knelt beside her, begging her daughter to stay with her. Ryan, who still hadn't realized that his sister was wounded, began shouting at Joseph to get out, but the uninvited guest had no intention of staying. Joseph managed to make a call and was picked up by his two friends in an SUV. They rushed him to the hospital, not giving a second thought to the condition they left the family members in, whose lives had just been forever changed. They simply abandoned them amidst all the chaos. While Cheryl called for help, she held Olivia in her arms and instructed her son to continuously apply pressure to the wound on Olivia's chest. Only then did the boy realize that his sister was injured. Olivia's lips had turned blue, and the bleeding had stopped. Ryan assisted his mother in carrying Olivia upstairs. They tried to stop the bleeding with towels. A neighbor arrived attempting to offer some assistance. Cheryl desperately tried to keep Olivia conscious. Later, she would tell the police that at some point, Olivia's body went limp and her eyes rolled upwards. It was at that moment that Cheryl realized Olivia had passed away. The police arrived at 10:10 p.m. An officer felt Olivia's faint heartbeat, and they carried her out of the house, rushing her to the nearest children's hospital in an ambulance. They held on to hope, but the doctors were unable to do anything. Olivia was pronounced dead at 11:24 p.m. Cheryl wasn't by her side when she passed, as she was receiving medical attention herself. Just a few hours earlier, it had been a normal, happy family, and now a mother and son were left as witnesses to the death of their 9-year-old daughter and sister. Meanwhile, a man named Thomas Cashman, known as Tommy, dressed in black but without the balaclava, rushed to the home of his former lover with whom he had a very brief affair. He entered her house without permission, scaring her terribly as he entered her bedroom. He was agitated and claimed that someone had tried to kill him, and he wanted to kill that person in return. In other words, he needed her help, and he was willing to say anything to get it. He even stated that she was the only one he could trust, despite having a fiancée with whom he had spent many years. The woman believed Tommy and offered him shelter for the night. However, the next morning, when all the media were buzzing about the shocking crime, she realized that Tommy had been involved in the shootout and was responsible for the death of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbel. Now, involuntarily, she became an accomplice. The woman was horrified by this prospect. On one hand, she didn't want to cover up a child killer, but on the other hand, any Liverpool resident knows how dangerous it can be to cross paths with criminal gangs. Uncertain about what to do, she called her boyfriend, Paul Russell. Paul arrived and had a private conversation with Tommy. Tommy immediately confessed to Paul that he had been hunting Joseph, but was abruptly cut off by Joseph, who asked him not to say anything about it to avoid implicating him in the crime. It was a very reasonable move on Joseph's part. What remains unclear is why he later made a significant mistake, giving Tommy different clothes, helping him get rid of the items he was wearing, and taking him to where his car was parked. Perhaps Paul understood that Tommy could pose a threat to him or his girlfriend and chose to assist him. But this act of help to a killer will likely have serious consequences for Paul as well. During this period, the investigation into the murder was in progress. Joseph Nee, who had suffered injuries, much like Cheryl and Olivia, declined to cooperate with the police. His primary concern was self-preservation, as the looming threat of returning to prison for violating his parole weighed heavily on him. Despite being involved in the criminal underworld, Joseph should have been able to surmise the identity of his assailant and whose orders the killer was following. Nevertheless, he informed the officers that anyone could have taken a shot at him that night. It's noteworthy that Joseph was not the only one apprehensive about engaging with law enforcement. Olivia had become the third Liverpool resident to succumb to gunshot wounds within a week, not to mention the numerous incidents where victims were shot but survived. In a city aptly nicknamed the British Amsterdam, crossing paths with criminal gangs was indeed perilous. A reward for information on Olivia's assailant had been announced, which quickly swelled to a record-high amount of £200,000, thanks to an anonymous contributor who added £100,000 to the fund. However, despite this substantial incentive, no one came forward with information. Nonetheless, the police succeeded in identifying a suspect, 34-year-old Thomas Cashman. He was a father of two, aged 4 and 14, engaged to a girl he had been dating since their school days. The family resided in a spacious suburban house in West Derby. Tommy had previously worked at a car wash, but his current lifestyle was vastly different. Officially unemployed, he rented a house that, in reality, belonged to the gang's leader. It was evident that his involvement in criminal activities afforded him a lavish life. Fortunately, Liverpool boasted extensive CCTV coverage, making it challenging to perpetrate an attack without being captured on camera. Investigation revealed that at 8:30 p.m., Tommy returned home, swiftly changed into black attire, and left his residence. He didn't make much effort to conceal himself while hunting his target. Surveillance footage documented him passing the house on Finch Lane several times before traversing past it once more. Tommy was convinced that his target was inside that house, having closely monitored his movements. He had even attempted to attack him earlier that day, though that endeavor had failed. When Joseph finally left the house, Tommy was resolute in his intent to eliminate him. However, fate took a different course, and an innocent bystander fell victim to a stray bullet. Such are the consequences when the worlds of ordinary individuals and criminals collide. Tommy's trousers, which he had provided to Paul Russell, were discovered at his sister's residence bearing his DNA. Gunpowder residue was also found on his right leg. Video evidence, DNA profiling, and gunpowder residue collectively linked him to the attack on Joseph. Yet the investigation had another valuable asset: a courageous witness who risked his life to oppose Liverpool's criminal underworld. In the early hours of September 4th, 2022, Tommy was apprehended while hiding at a friend's apartment. In October 2022, Tommy was formally charged with Olivia's murder, the attempted murder of Joseph and Cheryl, as well as possession of a firearm. Paul Russell faced charges of aiding and abetting, despite his earnest efforts to distance himself from the case. The trial of Tommy took place in Manchester in March 2023. Tommy denied all allegations. He claimed he hadn't killed anyone and that he appeared on the video because he was a local drug dealer, making deliveries that day and buying toys for his sick child. He added that he had no intention of killing anyone that day and that he had been friends with Joseph Nee for the past 10 years. However, his words were completely contradicted by a key prosecution witness. The remarkable effect came when Tommy's former girlfriend, who had sheltered him immediately after the crime, appeared in court. It was an incredibly brave move on her part, considering she lived in a city where many of Tommy's friends and gang members resided. Naturally, she would be protected under a witness protection program. As the police stated, she received more threats of violence than any other witness in Merseyside police history. She had to completely abandon her previous life, yet she chose to do the right thing. The witness explained her decision by saying that one should not be afraid to come forward when it involves the murder of a 9-year-old Olivia. The witness described how the accused came to her after the murder, trying to secure her support to create a false alibi. It's unclear why he couldn't ask his own fiancée for this favor. Tommy's defense team attempted to twist her words, suggesting that she wanted to frame her former lover because he refused to leave his fiancée for her. It was an absurd attempt to discredit the witness, and despite their efforts, she remained highly convincing. Following the witness's example, other people also found the courage to approach the police. They revealed that within criminal circles, Tommy was known as a contract killer or a hitman. He had been hired for various murders and was suspected in other homicide cases and assassination attempts, including another attempt on Joseph Nee's life. with the same weapon used to kill Olivia on that fateful day. In fact, the same weapon had been used on January 27, 2020, when a 19-year-old was shot. It was evident that Tommy had hired a criminal cartel to assassinate Joseph Nee. On March 30th, after 3.5 weeks of court proceedings, the jury unanimously found Thomas Cashman guilty on all counts. The sentencing was scheduled for April 3rd. On the same day, Olivia's family intended to address the court, speaking to the murderer and recounting how the crime he committed had affected their entire family. However, Tommy refused to even appear in court on that day. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole at a minimum of 42 years, making him 76 years old upon potential release. The judge commented on her decision, explaining that she would have preferred to sentence him to life without parole. However, she had to acknowledge the fact that Tommy didn't intend to kill Olivia. If he had intended to kill a child, he would have received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It was evident to everyone in court that his target was another criminal. The judge took into consideration that he was also a father and wouldn't be able to see his children as often as he would have liked, but that was solely his own fault. She emphasized that the man's refusal to appear in court was not taken into account. Paul Russell was also found guilty of aiding and abetting and is currently in prison awaiting his sentence. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, had hoped to look the killer in the eyes and express her thoughts about him. However, he deprived her of this opportunity by not appearing in court. Cheryl admits that she didn't know he could simply choose not to come. Therefore, Olivia's family, particularly Cheryl and Olivia's aunt Antonia, are advocating for changes in the law to require criminals to appear in court during sentencing and meet face-to-face with the victims' families. Since Olivia's murder, not much time has passed, and her mother admits that during these few months, she has been driven to madness by the deafening silence in their home. Olivia, from her childhood, was a chatterbox and giggler. If Olivia had survived in just 5 days, she would have performed a truly noble act. She intended to donate her hair to a charitable organization. She was eager to help an organization that makes wigs for sick children and had decided to cut off a whole 12 inches of her locks. People would have understood what a tremendous gesture it was coming from a 9-year-old girl. Giving a piece of herself to another child who needed it more would have shown just how wonderful Olivia was. The complete opposite of the people who invaded her home that August night in 2022 when Olivia took a bullet meant for a criminal. In memory of Olivia, other children created a beautiful corner in the park where she loved to play. They painted an enormous butterfly on the wall and planted flowers of a beautiful pink color. During Olivia's farewell at the church, hundreds of people gathered. Everything was adorned with pink butterflies. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, bid a moving farewell to her daughter, saying that Liv was loved and adored by everyone who knew her. She will never be forgotten. Cheryl added, "I won't say goodbye, but I'll say goodnight. I love you. We'll see you in the morning." Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear at the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa,
drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medin, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medin, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medin and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medin watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry, she was more in anger. However, Seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medin watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Cantu always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venancio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venancio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughters' torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities. On May 13, 2015, around 5 p.m., firefighters extinguished a raging fire in a garage by the roadside in the village of Sand Lake, Michigan. At that moment, a frightened woman ran up to their vehicle, shouting that her neighbors were dead. Several firefighters hurried with the woman to her neighbor's house. In the bedroom, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, were 2 lifeless bodies. It appeared that they had been shot. To preserve the evidence at the crime scene, the firefighters refrained from touching anything and immediately informed the police that they had found 2 bodies and required investigators and forensic experts. Forensic experts had been working at the crime scene for about an hour, collecting evidence and photographing the bodies of 46-year-old Martin Durham and 47-year-old Glenna Durham when one officer noticed a slight movement in Glenna's chest. Just a tiny bit. He rushed to her body and tried to feel for a pulse. But before he could touch her, Glenna's eyes opened wide, and she sat up abruptly, screaming, "What are you doing, Marty?" The officer immediately called for paramedics, who transported the injured woman to the local hospital. Marty and Glenna first met as teenagers in the early 1980s. Marty invited the girl on a date to a local open-air theater where they lost their virginity on the very same evening with little interest in the movie itself. Their relationship progressed quickly and passionately, but they broke up after a few months, partly because 17-year-old Glenna was married. Soon Marty started a family of his own. Christina Keller was 14 years old when she met 19-year-old Marty at a party held at his house. The young man seemed charming and fun to the girl, but also a little strange because he immediately declared that he would marry her someday. The next day, Marty showed up at her doorstep. Apparently, he made a favorable impression on Christina's parents because after that, he never left her life. Their friendship developed into a romantic relationship, and soon 16-year-old Christina discovered that she was expecting their first child. Within 2 years, she was carrying their second son, which prompted the young couple to get married. 11 months later, Christina gave her husband a daughter. Christina was 19 and Marty was 24 at the time. Initially, the young family lived with relatives, but in early 1995, Marty obtained a higher-paying job at a factory in Michigan, and the family of 5 moved there. However, on the evening of February 16, 1995, while returning from work, Marty was involved in a car accident. Another vehicle, speeding through a red light, collided with his car. The larger vehicle practically crushed Marty's car, trapping him inside. Marty was taken to the hospital, where he was in a clinically dead state for about 5 minutes. The left side of his body suffered severe injuries, and he remained in a coma for over 3 weeks. When he finally regained consciousness, he had no recollection of his wife, children, or much of his past life. He spent a year and a half learning to walk, speak, eat, and take care of himself again. Throughout this time, Christina supported him. Physically, Marty increasingly resembled his former self, but psychologically, he had changed. Due to the brain trauma, he experienced bouts of rage. He never raised his hand against his wife and children but became a domineering person. Even his sense of humor became darker. In 2000, almost 5 years after the accident, Christina filed for divorce. She still cared deeply for her husband, but her feelings had transformed into more of a maternal nature as she took on the role of his caregiver and could no longer relate to him in any other way. In May 2001, Marty purchased his first home using the funds he received from the insurance company, along with a bank loan. The house was located in the small village of Sand Lake, Michigan, where only 500 people reside. Marty was incredibly proud of his new home, where he moved in with his 2 sons and an African gray parrot named Bud. 2 months after moving into the house, Marty was surprised by a knock on his door from a 16-year-old girl who claimed to be his daughter. Marty asked who her mother was, and it turned out to be Glenna, his first love. The girl knew that her mother had had an affair early in her marriage, and she was born a few months later. She wanted to establish her paternity for certain. A DNA test confirmed that the girl was indeed Marty's biological daughter, born out of wedlock. This revelation led to the rekindling of Marty and Glenna's relationship, despite Glenna still being married. Clearly, Glenna had never been able to forget Marty, as she had a tattoo with his name on her arm throughout her marriage. Glenna divorced her husband and moved in with Marty. They were very happy together and soon had a new wedding ceremony. Glenna's new husband meant everything to her. The couple spent all their time together, visiting family, and going to the local casino once or twice a week. Even when Marty went hunting, Glenna would sit in the car and read a novel. Officially taking on the responsibility of caring for her husband, Glenna received $3,200 per month for her services. Marty's disability benefits amounted to over $1,000 per month. Additionally, Glenna sold excess medication from Marty, so their monthly income was approximately $5,000. When Marty's sons moved out, this income was sufficient for their life in the small village. However, by 2010, Marty's health, both mental and physical, had deteriorated significantly. The couple continued to spend all their time together and with their friends, including Connie and Keith Ream, another neighboring couple. On Monday, May 11, 2015, Marty offered to mow the lawn in Connie and Keith's backyard. He enjoyed doing this work and did it completely free of charge. Later that evening, all four of them, Connie, Keith, Marty, and Glenna, sat on the neighbor's terrace, and the Durhams returned home around 9 p.m. The next day, on Tuesday, at 8:26 a.m., Keith sent Marty a message asking how he was feeling, but he didn't receive a response. This was strange because Marty always promptly answered calls and messages. Throughout the day, Keith sent several more messages to his friend with the same result. Later that day, Connie approached the neighbor's door and knocked. She heard the Shelby family's dog barking, but no one opened the door. Keith even sent a joking message to Glenna saying, "What did you do to Marty?" Of course, she didn't respond to him either. On Wednesday, at 7:30 a.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house again and rang the doorbell. The only response she received was the dog barking. She walked around the house, checking if any doors or windows were open. Everything was locked as usual. Throughout the day, Connie and Keith tried to contact their neighbors, becoming increasingly worried. After work, around 4:30 p.m., Connie approached the neighbor's house for the third time and knocked. She was sure she would have to break the door, but to her surprise, when she touched the handle, she discovered that the door was not locked this time. Connie cautiously opened the door and called out for the neighbors. But at the door, she was only met by the Shelby family pet, who led her into the living room where there was a gruesome mess. Documents and photographs were scattered everywhere, a broken lamp and other items were in disarray. Following Shelby into the bedroom, Connie found the homeowners lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Marty was only in his underwear, while Glenna was fully dressed, with her legs covered by a blanket. Connie rushed out of the neighbor's house and ran towards a fire truck she noticed further down the road. Marty was not as lucky as his wife. 5 bullets that hit his back, forearm, and chest left him no chance of survival. He had been dead for several days. Glenna was shot twice, with both shots hitting the area behind her right ear. Blood was found not only in the bedroom, but also on the chair in the living room and on a pillow with 2 bullet holes. Underneath the chair, a gun and 2 empty shells were found. In the bedroom, there were 5 more shell casings, 1 near the door and 4 near Marty's body, totaling 7 in total. However, the gun found near the chair was designed for 6 bullets. This means that the perpetrator found time to reload the gun before continuing the shooting. Apart from the living room and bedroom, the rooms in the house appeared completely normal. There were no signs of forced entry, and in the kitchen, there was a bowl of spaghetti and a piece of garlic bread on the table. Later that same evening, when Glenna was taken to the hospital, Marty's children were allowed to take the family pets, a dog and a parrot, and bring them to their mother's house, Christina. Although the children were only permitted to take the pets, the trio did not miss the opportunity to search the house and discovered a sealed envelope with the word personal written on it. Inside, they found letters from Glenna addressed to her children and ex-husband. In the letters, she expressed her love for the children and asked for their forgiveness for not being the best mother. She also asked her ex-husband to take care of the children. Additionally, in Glenna's drawer, they found a packet of unpaid bills. They handed over all the findings to the police. The investigators began questioning the family's relatives and friends about their relationships and financial situation. They loved spending time together and were truly absorbed in each other's company. However, it soon became clear that they were facing serious financial difficulties. Glenna was in charge of the family's accounts, and relatives believed that Marty was unaware of the severity of their situation because he was quite frugal. On the other hand, Glenna had developed a serious addiction to gambling. She would spend hundreds of dollars on lottery tickets and lose thousands of dollars at the casino. But whenever her husband approached her, She would pretend to be playing with $1 bills. She played every week, and in 2010 alone, Glenna spent $75,000 on her addiction. The family had fallen behind on tax payments, had credit card debt, and Marty's car was on the verge of being repossessed. However, the most pressing issue was their home. Glenna hadn't made mortgage payments for over a year, and they had accumulated a debt of $48,000. In early April 2015, a few weeks before the attack on the family, Marty's mother saw a list of homes that would be seized due to debts, and Marty's address was listed there. She called Glenna, who assured her that the newspaper had printed the wrong address and that she would sort it out. Of course, it turned out that their home was indeed being taken away. Despite the fact that Marty had taken out the mortgage, on April 28th, Glenna received a notice that their home would be auctioned if they didn't pay $5,000. Interestingly, the auction was scheduled for May 12th, just a day before Marty and Glenna were found by their neighbor. The investigators concluded that Marty was unaware of the impending loss of their home because he had been renovating it for the past 2 months. Just 2 days before their deaths, he had painted the bathroom. After 3 days in the intensive care unit, Glenna regained consciousness. She had no recollection of the day of the murders or the preceding days. She couldn't even remember writing the letters to her children and ex-husband. Since the eyewitness couldn't provide any helpful information, the police had few leads or clues to work with. The weapon contained multiple DNA samples, as Marty was an avid hunter and often showed his firearms to friends. However, Glenna and Marty also sold drugs, for which they received cash payments, and large sums of money were stored in envelopes in a safe. Could this have been an unplanned robbery? The living room was in disarray, as if someone had been searching for something, and the cash from the safe was indeed missing. This version of events seemed the most plausible, but finding the killer among the clients of their illegal activities was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A whole year passed before an unexpected witness helped solve the case. It was a 19-year-old parrot named Bud, who had been living with Christina for the past 12 months. Bud was an African grey parrot and had the unique ability of not only mimicking sounds and words he heard in his environment but also imitating human voices. Originally, he was Christina's beloved pet, but Marty took him, presumably as a way to get back at his ex-wife for leaving him. Upon returning to his beloved owner, Bud started reproducing various conversations he had heard while living with Marty, such as how Marty played with the dog. But at some point, he began repeating an argument between a man and a woman. They were clearly arguing with each other, raising their voices and occasionally mixing profanity with regular words. And at the end of the dialogue, a male voice shouted clearly, "No, no, don't shoot." Christina recorded this scene performed by the parrot on video but didn't report it to the police, thinking it would be laughed off. However, when a local journalist interviewed Marty's mother a year after his murder, she mentioned the video. The journalist became very interested and aired it on the news. The video quickly went viral, and the increased public attention forced the police to reopen the case and focus their attention on one suspect, Glenna Durham. They examined Marty and Glenna's phones and discovered that the last thing Marty did on his phone was search for information about lawnmowers on the evening of the 11th, after they returned home from the neighbors. The examination of Glenna's phone turned out to be much more intriguing. It had been used until the 13th, the day the bodies were found. From 3:32 a.m. to 4:48 a.m.,
Someone used the phone 5 times to find information about the gun used in the shootings, including how to reload it. The last message was sent to Glenna's mother at 4:48 a.m. and said, "I love you, forgive me."
Glenna was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She insisted on her innocence, and her lawyer tried to prove that another family member or a stranger had broken into the house to steal medication, cash, or Marty's weapons. However, the forensic experts did not find any signs of forced entry into the house. And what about the money from the safe? It turned out that Marty's children had taken it while they were searching the house when Glenna was taken to the hospital and their father to the morgue. When investigators accidentally learned about this, they stated that nobody had asked them about the money at the police station, so they didn't say anything. In any case, the version of a robber was discarded because nothing was stolen. The prosecution's version of events painted a much more plausible picture. Here's what they believed happened. Since Marty was in his underwear, he could have been killed on the morning of the 12th. The man must have learned about the inevitable loss of the house, became very upset, and a heated argument ensued. When Glenna grabbed the weapon, Marty turned and tried to run into the bedroom. She shot him in the back. Marty was still on his feet, reaching for another weapon in the bedside table. Glenna fired again, hitting his forearm. Only then did he turn to face her, and she sent 3 more bullets into his chest. Marty fell lifeless on the bedroom floor. Glenna spent the whole day doing paperwork. She wrote letters to her ex-husband and children and prepared spaghetti for lunch. When the neighbor showed up at her house for the first time on the evening of the 12th, Glenna was still engaged in these activities. Understanding that the neighbors would start to worry about her and Marty, no matter what Glenna planned, she needed to act quickly. She settled into a chair in the living room, placed a pillow against her head, and fired. However, nothing happened. The pillow absorbed the force of the shot, and the bullet barely grazed her. Since it was the last bullet in the pistol, she had to look up online how to reload it. This means she did not attempt it again until the early morning of the 13th when she sent a message to her mother. Perhaps she still had doubts when Connie knocked on the door again at 7:30 a.m. because the door was still locked. But when Connie left, Glenna must have unlocked the door, sat in the chair, took the pillow, and tried again. This time the injury turned out to be more serious, but as her doctor later explained, she did not hit any important veins, arteries, or penetrate the skull. It's hard to imagine what state she was in, but since head wounds always bleed profusely, she may have decided that she would simply bleed out. She made her way to the bedroom, where her husband's body had been lying all this time, and collapsed on the floor, covering her legs with a blanket. Whether she staged the scene when the police officer touched her or only regained consciousness at that moment is unknown. And we may never know because Glenna continues to claim memory loss. The jury believed the prosecution's version. On Wednesday, July 19, 2017, after 9 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of murder. Glenna Durham was sentenced to life imprisonment. Of course, the parrot named Bader was not invited to court as a witness. And it's not because he swears terribly. It's simply impossible to prove that he didn't hear that particular dialogue on a TV show or the radio, not to mention how he could take an oath in the witness stand. In other words, if Bader had participated in the process and less than 24 hours had passed since Glenna's guilty verdict, her lawyer would have filed an appeal. Late spring of 1995, Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset, an ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and called for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there, with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports. and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to health Mark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced, and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service.
In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schuett was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold onto her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios, between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car.
Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Vanber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, the young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Vanber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The two reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Mark's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Mark were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Mark with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Mark never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Mark's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Mark's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all since, theoretically, he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Mark Van Ber did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Mark suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Mark hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed two almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Van Ba family would never have suspected her of anything. Poria Mumnai and Cassandre Bouvier became friends in Paris while studying at the Sorbonne. The girls were passionate about the cultures of other countries, especially Latin America, so they studied the history, social and political movements, and culture of the region. Poria, who was born in Morocco, was 24 years old. After completing her thesis on Argentina, she decided to put aside her books and visit the country she had written about. Cassandra, at the age of 29, was no stranger to traveling the world, so she gladly accepted her friend's invitation. The girls packed their suitcases and embarked on a journey through the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. In July 2011, the friends arrived in Salta. It is a province located in the northwest of Argentina with a very interesting geographical, social, and historical repertoire. The landscapes ranged from snow-capped peaks in the Huesca Plains with a tropical dry climate in the east. The architecture includes churches and cathedrals built during the colonial period, ideal for exploration and study by curious students. However, it is worth noting that, like many provinces in the north of the country and probably throughout Latin America, Salta maintains conservative customs. The influence of the Catholic Church on people's daily lives is significant, and the differences between social classes are pronounced. Politics is controlled by a few influential families who have held power for decades. It is important to mention that as this story unfolds, things will become clearer shortly. On July 15th, Cassandra and Horia checked into a hotel in Salta and set out to explore the sites without unpacking their belongings, as they planned to return to Buenos Aires. Salta is a popular province among tourists, known for its low crime rate and friendly population, especially towards tourists. The main attraction in Salta is the natural reserve called Quebrada de San Lorenzo. At exactly 16:23 on July 15th, the girls purchased tickets to visit the reserve. They decided not to hire a guide and ventured deep into the forest. From Buenos Aires, they were supposed to contact their families and inform them of the next city they planned to visit. However, no word was heard from them. On the 19th, unable to bear the uncertainty, their families reached out to Cassandra and Horia's acquaintances in Argentina and asked them to contact the police. 2 weeks later, a group of tourists from a neighboring town embarked on the same trail as the French girls. They arrived at the reserve quite late in the evening, but it was not unusual in this area. Around 1800 hours, one of the tourists separated from the group to find a secluded spot in the dense undergrowth. There, he noticed something resembling a body. Approaching and confirming that it was indeed a body, he screamed and rushed back to the group to inform them of his discovery. The police arrived at the reserve around 10 p.m. The tourists had not marked the exact location where they found the body, only mentioning that it was near a viewpoint. Therefore, in the darkness and amidst the dense vegetation, the police initially struggled to locate it. Eventually, they found the body, but before they could begin their work, they discovered 2 more victims just a few meters away. It turned out to be the 2 missing French tourists. The police developed several theories, including the possibility that the girls were accidentally shot by a local hunter, as many residents in the area hunt for food. Therefore, the search focused on local residents. The police arrested Francisco Tejeda, who worked as a horseback riding guide for tourists. However, he was released just a few days later as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. His wife told the press that her husband was arrested solely because they were poor people. The police needed a scapegoat to appease public opinion. Immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the police shared with the press that they had been lying in the forest for about 3 days. Since the girls had kept their tickets to the reserve for the 15th, various theories arose about what could have happened to them during the remaining days when they were reported missing. It was speculated that they might have been kidnapped, held captive somewhere, and then disposed of. However, the police later clarified that the girls were killed 14 days prior, and they had been lying in the reserve near the viewpoint all that time. Due to Cassandra's torn clothing and Uria's pants and underwear being pulled down to her knees, speculations about violence against the girls emerged. The autopsy confirmed this. The tourists were severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot with a .22 caliber firearm. In the reserve, the police found a corresponding shell casing. They concluded that the girls had managed to take a walk and returned to the entrance of the reserve. There were few visitors at that time, the sun was setting, and the weather was not conducive to late walks. Obviously, it was then that the perpetrator or perpetrators approached their victims, with one attacker assaulting Cassandra. After the violence inflicted upon her, the girl was shot in the head while kneeling before her killer. Uria, who witnessed Cassandra's murder, decided not to give up too easily. A clump of hair remained in her clenched fist, indicating her struggle with at least one assailant. Then, according to investigators' assumptions, the girl dashed down the slope from the height when she was caught by a bullet. It hit her in the back, passing through her shoulder. The culprits left, believing that Uria was also finished. However, she was still alive and attempted to crawl back to the trail. Nevertheless, her attempts were unsuccessful as she was too weak and endured several more hours of agony before succumbing to blood loss. The investigators examined the girl's hotel room and found only one phone among their belongings, instead of the expected 2. By determining the location of Uria's phone, they discovered that a local girl named Maria Fernanda Cañizares, the daughter of a former police officer, was using it. They also found Uria's camera in her possession. The girl claimed that these were gifts from her boyfriend, Gustavo Lossi. Gustavo, 23 years old, worked as a guide in the reserve, and his father sold tickets to tourists. It was Gustavo who had offered his services to the French girls, but they declined. Gustavo had changed the SIM card in the phone, thinking that would be enough to avoid detection. Not immediately, but Gustavo Lossi confessed to being present at the crime scene and participating in the violence. However, he claimed that he was not the instigator or the killer of the French girls, but merely a witness. He recounted that upon hearing noise and running to the screams, he witnessed 2 men, 24-year-old Daniel Vilt, a stonemason, and 31-year-old Santos Clemente Vera, a gardener from the San Lorenzo plain, tormenting the girls. Supposedly, these men coerced him into participating in the violence and then allowed him to leave. However, he didn't forget to take the girl's phone and camera with him. However, during a search of Gustavo's home, the police discovered the weapon that fired the fatal shots. Uria's camera helped the police establish the exact time of the attack on the French girls. The girls were enjoying sightseeing and took several photos just before embarking on a hike through the reserve. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, at 6:28 p.m., the tourists took their last photo, which turned out blurry and unclear, allowing investigators to speculate that the attack occurred precisely at that moment. All 3 men were charged with murder. Witnesses immediately came forward, pointing to Vilt as the person who attempted to sell a rifle. However, he had a solid alibi as he was at a bank during the time of the attack and could prove it. In 2014, Gustavo Lossi was sentenced for 30 years in prison, while Vera was released due to insufficient evidence and his denial of guilt. He also claimed to have an alibi. However, the prosecutor demanded a review of the case, and in 2016, both men were sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed that one of the most high-profile cases in Argentine history had reached its conclusion. But no, the story doesn't end there. French journalist Jean-Charles Chattard dedicated 4 years to his own investigation of this case and wrote a book presenting his arguments as to why the girls couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve on July 15, as the investigators claim. The journalist is convinced that the girls didn't die in the reserve, their bodies were simply brought there after the murder. Firstly, even after a short walk in the reserve, his shoes were covered in dust and dirt, unlike the victim's shoes. The girls couldn't have taken such a path, then endured violence, fought for their lives, and still had clean shoes. Secondly, the appearance of the tourists, in general, was strange. Their clothing was more suited for an evening event in the city rather than a hike in the nature reserve. The next strange thing is that the bodies lay in Quebrada de San Lorenzo for 2 weeks. The reserve is a wild, open area inhabited by pumas, foxes, and condors. After such a period, the police could have found completely gnawed bones. However, the bodies were discovered without a single bite mark, not to mention that they were lying in a popular reserve near a frequently visited viewpoint. Finally, the pathologist who examined the bodies confidently stated that they were killed 3 to a maximum of 5 days before the autopsy. Regarding the date of the murders, the doctor is categorical and indicated in the report that it was July 26, 2011. Remarkably, the judge who led the investigation changed this date to July 15th. Could it be possible that the judge intentionally manipulated the facts to protect someone? Could the judge intentionally tamper with evidence? Was he trying to protect someone? This is exactly what Nestor Piccolo, the commissioner in charge of the investigation, was convinced of, and it may have cost him his life. Commissioner Piccolo died under mysterious circumstances 4 months after the start of the investigation. He was found at the entrance of the commissioner's office with a bullet in his head. His mother stated that it was her son's decision, but she is certain that he was killed, and it was an execution. No traces of gunpowder were found on Nestor's hands, and before his death, he was working on a new version. According to Clemente Vera, he is innocent, and Gustavo Lossi is simply an accomplice of the real criminals, representatives of the upper classes of the province. Nicholas's investigation worried many people who wanted to hide the truth, including the judge. And the influential local families could not allow the light to be shed on the deaths of the French girls. However, this conspiracy of silence was interrupted in April 2014 by an anonymous letter describing the same trail that Commissioner Piccolo was investigating. The letter was sent to the victims' families in France. Chattard received a copy of it and pursued this lead. The anonymous letter was handwritten by a woman who chose not to sign it out of fear of testifying in court. Chattard spent several months, but eventually found a witness. It turned out to be a girl who is often in the company of a small circle of influential individuals in Salta. She knew that on July 15, 2011, the 2 tourists couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve because they were invited to a party organized by the city's wealthy youth. She paints a completely different picture of what happened. At such parties, alcohol flows freely and everything resembles a movie, but it's all happening in real life. According to the girl, Cassandra and Uriah were among the guests and were seen near the pool. As the evening progressed and more drinks were consumed, the men became increasingly interested in the attractive French women. Around 3 a.m., they led them inside the house, and no one saw them after that. The guys started harassing one of the tourists. Of course, she refused, but her opinion no longer mattered to the men, and things went too far. Her friend witnessed what happened, so the guys decided to kill both of them to prevent the truth from being revealed. However, they didn't rush. They tortured the victims for several days before finally killing them. The witness provided the exact location where this supposedly happened, a villa in the most fashionable district of the city, Buena Vista, where deputies, ministers, and wealthy foreigners reside. The villa is usually not occupied permanently as it is often rented out for private parties. There is also a pool, which is where the French women were last seen. But the most intriguing part is the villa's location, right beneath where the bodies were found. Behind the house, there is a hidden path leading to the lookout point of the nature reserve. If everything happened as the witness claims, the bodies of the girls were carried under the cover of night, taken through that path, and left in the dense undergrowth of the reserve. However, how could such a wild scenario, unfolding at a party in plain sight, remain a secret for so long? The witness claims that it can be explained by the terror imposed by the real criminals on anyone who dares to speak up. According to her, the party was organized by the son of a deputy who attacked the French woman. When she tried to escape, he severely beat her. 2 other sons of the politician were also involved in the assault and later in the murder. Today, the deputy's face calmly looks down from numerous billboards during his latest election campaign. By the way, one of his sons followed in his father's footsteps and became a politician as well. The politician refused to comment on these allegations, but one judge who presided over the initial investigation showed a great interest in the story described in the anonymous letter. He believes that it contains everything necessary to achieve justice. However, the judge who took over the case afterward had no intention of seeking other culprits. He believes that the family must be very influential to manipulate the police, and he attributes the deaths of the French women to the provincial justice system. The new version gives more weight to the witness's story, according to which he saw the 2 French women leaving the nature reserve on July 15. This means that the crime could have occurred in a different place and at a different time than what the investigators insist on. As for the blurred photographs supposedly taken during the attack in the nature reserve, Cassandra's father, Jean-Michel Bouvier, submitted the photo to an expert who believes that it has been manipulated using a photo editing program. The angle of the shot and the lighting cannot be as depicted in the photograph. In France, the victims' families no longer expect anything from the justice system. Jean-Michel Bouvier conducted an independent DNA analysis on his daughter's body. DNA from Gustavo Lossi and 2 other male individuals, as well as 1 female DNA, were found on the most intimate parts. There was no trace of Clemente Vera's sample. The ownership of the other samples remains unknown, raising questions about the identities of the other individuals involved in the attack on the girls and the true role of Gustavo Lossi. Meanwhile, in the heart of San Lorenzo, a few hundred meters from the place where Cassandra and Uriah's bodies were found, there still stands the modest home of Clemente Vera's parents. After their son's arrest, they struggle to make ends meet as they are unable to work the land or care for animals in their advanced age. Clemente's parents, his wife, and many local residents believe in his innocence. They believe that his only fault is living close to the crime scene and not having the means to afford lawyers. It is especially sad considering that nothing in the case files connects him to the crime. He claims that the police beat him, that threatened him and his child, demanding a confession to the murder. When he refused to comply, they ransacked his house in search of any incriminating evidence, but they were unsuccessful. In connection with this, in 2017, Santos Clemente Vera filed a complaint with the Supreme Court of Argentina, and in June 2020, he was granted permission for a case review. He hopes that a new trial will be conducted, during which he will be acquitted. Interestingly, Cassandra's father is convinced of his innocence. He witnessed all the hearings, traveled to Argentina multiple times to learn the details of the case, and conducted his own investigation, concluding that Vera did not commit the crime. Therefore, he visited Vera in prison, apologized to him, and then started a social media campaign for his release. Bouvier is concerned that the case review is taking an endlessly long time, while an innocent person continues to sit in prison in Salta. On November 25, 2013, On the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a monument was solemnly unveiled in memory of Cassandra and Uriah. Alfredo Garzon, a sculptor from Salta who lived in Paris, responded to Jean-Michel Bouvier's request to take on this work. By depicting an outstretched hand, eyes, and the face with an anguished expression, Alfredo managed to create a very powerful image conveying the pain, horror, and suffering that the girls went through. The sculpture is located in the San Lorenzo ravine, where the victims' bodies were found. Lola Luna Chomnales was born on November 4, 1999, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She grew up in the family of Adriana Belmonte and Diego Chomnales, the son of the renowned chef Beatriz Chomnales. In November 2014, when the girl turned 15, her parents decided to gift her a trip to New York for the Christmas holidays. However, before that, they sent their daughter to spend a few days relaxing with her godmother's family in Rocha, Uruguay. On December 27th, Lola arrived in Uruguay, where she was greeted by her godmother, Claudia Fernandez. The girl was clearly in a great mood, which was captured in a photo taken by Claudia. Claudia, her husband Hernan Tuzinkivch, and their 2 children were happy about Lola's arrival. They had planned to spend these few days together, sunbathing on Barra de Veliz's beach, swimming in the sea, and relaxing. That same evening, Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson visited a drum festival taking place in the city center. Hernan and the boy didn't leave Lola's side in the crowd, but at some point, the boy moved away from them because he was bored. Nevertheless, after the festival, they all returned home together. The next day, the family went to the beach. Around 3 p.m., Lola asked her godmother for permission to take a walk along the beach. She wanted to walk to the spa resort of Aguas Dulces along a fairly popular trail that allowed her to explore the flora and fauna of the area. Since the route was considered popular and safe for walks, and the locals were known for their friendliness, Claudia had no objections. She told Lola what time they would be waiting for her at home and watched as she calmly walked away from them along the beach. Lola was wearing a bikini and denim shorts. She carried a backpack containing a sarong, a book, her identification, a water bottle, and a towel. She didn't have her phone with her. Obviously, there was poor reception on the beach. The backpack also contained a wallet with 2,000 Uruguayan pesos. Several hours passed, it got dark, and Lola still hadn't returned. Her godmother became worried. The family walked along the route that Lola had planned to take, but she was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Claudia called Lola's parents to explain what had happened. She told Adriana that she had already contacted the police. However, it took another 45 minutes before they arrived at the station and reported the teenager's disappearance. The police began the search for Lola. Since she disappeared during a walk on the beach, it was thoroughly searched both lengthwise and crosswise. Helicopters and search dogs were brought in to assist in the search. Lola's parents immediately arrived in Uruguay to help the police. Almost simultaneously with the start of the investigation, it became known that Adriana and Diego were receiving anonymous calls. The caller did not ask for a ransom or make any demands. They simply stated that Lola was with them and that she was fine. Unfortunately, this turned out to be untrue. 2 days later, on December 30th, her body was found partially covered in sand on the beach. She was in an area with many dunes and dense vegetation. There were shallow knife cuts on her neck and signs of blows on her head. The autopsy revealed that Lola was attacked from behind, then dragged or forced to the location where she was found. The killer pressed her face into the sand for a prolonged period until she suffocated. This was determined by the presence of sand in her lungs. After the news of the crime became known, there was an unprecedented uproar in the press of Argentina and Uruguay. As often happens in such cases, journalists began to put forward theories about what could have happened. The suspicions of the Uruguayan police and the media immediately fell on the family of Lola's godmother, especially on Hernan, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, they claimed to Adriana and Diego that they had already contacted the police, although they actually delayed before going to the station. Secondly, the media tried to see something sinister in the fact that Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson went to a drum festival together, but at some point, the boys separated from them, leaving the girl with Hernan. A hypothesis related to violence against Lola emerged, but the forensic expert found no evidence to support this. However, there were other reasons to suspect them. Claudia and Hernan immediately hired a lawyer, and not a single family member agreed to take a polygraph test. Lola's parents added fuel to the fire by making a series of bold statements. In particular, Diego stated that he had long ceased to trust Hernan, which provoked further questions. If he didn't trust the man, why did he allow his daughter to go on vacation with them? It is important to note that Claudia and Adriana had been friends for 25 years. Hernan was Claudia's second husband, and Lola's parents had known him for about 5 years. They all originally lived in Argentina, but Hernan and Claudia moved to Uruguay. When Hernan was interrogated, the investigators noted contradictory statements, which led to his arrest on December 31st. Claudia was arrested on suspicion of concealing evidence. Her son was also detained because he was suspected of making those anonymous calls. It is not confirmed with certainty that he was the one who called Adriana and Diego, but it is evident that those calls were a failed attempt at a joke. Nevertheless, the police interrogated all 3 family members for several days, but there was no evidence against them. The investigators explained that they found some discrepancies in their testimonies, but they were insignificant. Hernan claimed they returned home at 11 o'clock, while his son said it was 12. Besides that, the police had nothing to charge Hernan, Claudia, or her son with. Therefore, on January 2, 2015, they were all released. Apparently, after various public statements, the relationship between the friends suffered. Claudia and her loved ones never spoke to Lola's parents again, nor did they pick up the phone to offer condolences. Adriana believes that their lawyer may have given them such advice. However, she believes that as friends, a simple human gesture would have been to call and express condolences, especially considering their 25 years of friendship. A few days after the discovery of the body, Lola's pink backpack was found. It was also buried in the sand about 200 meters from where Lola's body was found. This immediately raised a lot of questions. How did the police initially not find the body and now the backpack, despite thoroughly searching the entire beach and its surroundings multiple times? Additionally, the authorities in the town had claimed from the beginning that the beach was a very safe area. But it was at least strange because drug dealers operated there, especially in the area where the body was found. Nonetheless, almost all of the girl's belongings remained in the backpack, except for 2,000 pesos that the perpetrator took from her wallet. Furthermore, the towel and documents had bloodstains on them. Forensic experts examined these items and found Lola's DNA on them, but it was mixed with male DNA. Since suspicions had not been completely lifted from Hernan, his DNA was compared to the one found. They checked it against the Uruguayan police database, but there were no matches there either. After the discovery of the backpack, one suspect caused a big stir. He was suspected based on witness testimonies regarding his whereabouts on the day of the murder. According to local residents, a man nicknamed El Conejo, the rabbit, was working on a roof near the beach at the time the girl went for a walk. In the middle of the day, the man went for lunch, and his colleagues knew that he didn't have any money with him. However, he returned with food and cash. This immediately raised the question of where he got the food if he didn't buy it. But that's not all. Someone even claimed to have seen him with a pink backpack on the day of Lola's disappearance. One newspaper wrote that he confessed to the murder, and other media outlets picked up the news. However, it turned out to be untrue. The man provided an explanation of where he got the food. Although the police suspected that he had actually stolen it from beachgoers, there was no evidence connecting him to Lola's case. He never confessed to anything, and after his release, he filed a lawsuit against the newspapers that spread unverified news. At this point, the investigation significantly stalled. The main suspects had already been released, and the investigators had no leads to pursue. At first glance, it seemed that the girl didn't know anyone in the town, but she had managed to attend a drum festival in the city center, and being sociable and open, she freely interacted with people. Therefore, the police had to investigate this lead. They detained and interrogated about 40 people, mainly vendors and dealers from the beach, but they were all eventually released. The situation was further aggravated by the constant changes in prosecutors and judges, and whenever a new prosecutor was appointed, they would review the case from scratch. This significantly hindered the investigation. But on February 18, 2015, there seemed to be some progress in the case. An anonymous call was made to the police. The caller stated that Angel Moreira, also known as El Cachila or Keisha, was involved in the crime. The police arrested and interrogated the man. He worked on the beach, parking cars. Angel explained that he met Lola when she was walking along the beach. He approached her to offer some souvenir trinkets for sale. They exchanged a few sentences about where the girl came from when Lola mentioned feeling dizzy. Angel suggested that they go to a shady area. He took her to a place where tall bushes and dunes provided some shade and coolness. There, the girl fell to her knees. Angel tried to check her pulse, but not hearing it, he got scared and ran away. The statement sounded extremely strange, but without evidence, the police had to release him. 4 years passed when the new prosecutor in Jorge Bay's case reviewed the materials and decided to interrogate Angel again. After the interrogation on May 22, 2019, the man was arrested. This time he was charged with obstruction of justice. His DNA did not match the DNA on Lola's towel and documents, so the prosecutor concluded that he was covering up the person who was truly guilty of the crime. Bass explained that in Angel's statements made in 2015, he revealed details that only someone who was with Lola at the time of the murder could have known. He knew that Lola fell to her knees on the sand, and a forensic expert confirmed this. However, Lola didn't fall because she suddenly felt dizzy, but because she had received shallow knife wounds. Despite Angel's arrest, the Chommiles family still awaited an answer to the main question for several more years. Until geneticist Natalia Sandberg became interested in the case, 7 years after the murder, the case took a decisive turn. And how the investigators found the suspect resembles a plot from a detective novel. It occurred to Natalia Sandberg to trace the genetic DNA trace of an unknown man found on Lola's towel and documents. There were no matches on the paternal line, but the examination of the maternal line revealed a small match with a prisoner serving time for murder. In other words, the man who left his blood on Lola's towel is related to the man currently serving a sentence. The third crime, in which the victims were Marines who died in the naval complex on Cerro de Montevideo, was the tip of the iceberg that allowed investigators to reach the true killer of Lola Chommiles. The murders took place on Sunday morning, May 31, 2020. Juan Manuel Escobar, Alex Galinia, and Alan Rodriguez were found shot in the head. The police established that the killer is Jonathan Brand Gundy. Jonathan was born in Rocha. When the police found his mother and examined her DNA, it became clear that they were looking for another son of the woman, Jonathan's half-brother. The woman told the investigators that she had given birth to 11 children from different fathers, including 8 boys. But only one son was given up for adoption when he was 18 days old. It turned out that he was the one the police had been searching for 7 years. Their new suspect was named Leonardo Senar. In 2014, during Lola's murder, Senar was homeless, spending his days and nights between La Paloma, Chuy, and Castillos. He lived in these places through odd jobs. But recently, he settled in the city of Chuy, lived with a girlfriend, and worked in a bakery. The man had a history of police records from 2003 to 2009 for aggression, theft, and violence. Despite his run-ins with the law, his DNA was not stored in the database because the database itself was created after 2012. Therefore, on May 18, 2022, the police obtained a search warrant for his house. They anticipated that the man would refuse to provide his DNA, and they were right. However, forensic experts examined the man's toothbrush and comb. To the surprise and joy of the forensic experts, the DNA match was 99.9%, confirming it was his DNA. On May 19th, the suspect was arrested at the border with Brazil. During the interrogation, Leonardo claimed that he had no connection to the crime. As for his DNA found on the identification card and the girl's towel, he explained that he found a pink backpack on the beach. When he looked inside, he saw a wallet with 2,000 pesos and stole the money. Regarding the blood, he said that a few hours before, he cut himself with a bottle shard at work, and when he reached into the backpack, the bandage fell off and the cut started bleeding. Therefore, he wiped his hand with Lola's towel. However, there were several inconsistencies in his version. Firstly, his blood was not simply found on the girl's belongings, it was mixed with her blood. This couldn't have happened if he found the backpack and just took out the wallet. Secondly, according to his own words, someone else, not Leonardo, took Lola's backpack on the 28th, the day of the murder, after Leonardo stole the money and inexplicably buried it 4 kilometers away from where it was found, without taking anything from it. Even the suspect couldn't deny the absurdity of this story. Finally, his colleagues who worked with him in December 2014 didn't recall the incident with a broken bottle and Leonardo's cut. Moreover, according to documentation, Leonardo was no longer employed at the brewery on the day of the crime. Here is what the police believe actually happened. In the middle of the day on December 28, 2014, when Lola went for a walk on the beach, she was intercepted by Leonardo and Angel. They dragged her into an area with dunes and bushes. There, Lola tried to escape, and the kidnappers struck her several times on the head and stabbed her in the neck, causing her to fall to her knees. However, these wounds were not fatal, and Lola continued to resist. It is likely that she also screamed loudly, trying to attract the attention of other vacationers or beach vendors. In an attempt to silence Lola, they pressed her face into the sand. They pressed for too long, causing Lola to suffocate. The police believe that the motive for the crime was violence, although the assailants were unable to carry out their intended act and ended up killing her because they did not expect such fierce resistance from the teenage girl. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that Leonardo was previously tried for a case very similar to Lola's. That case occurred in 2009 when Leonardo was 26 years old. The victim was a 15-year-old girl, just like Lola. Leonardo followed her for several blocks before attacking her with a knife. He dragged the victim to a remote wooded area where he assaulted her. The Uruguayan police are convinced that at least 2 people were involved in the attack on Lola. Therefore, they charged Leonardo with aggravated murder and Angel with harboring a criminal. Jorge Base demanded a sentence of 10 years of imprisonment for Angel and 15 to 30 years for Leonardo. In June 2021, Angel, who had been in prison since 2019, was released by a judge's decision granting him conditional early release under oath. Despite psychiatric and psychological evaluations characterizing Angel as an aggressive and impulsive individual lacking impulse control, the judge found no grounds to accuse him of harboring a criminal, as harboring entails assisting the criminal after the crime has been committed. In this case, Angel should have been charged as an accomplice. Therefore, according to the judge, Angel Moreira's actions do not fall under the category of harboring. However, the prosecutor filed an appeal against the judge's decision, stating that Angel was present before, during, and after the crime. Despite their initial suspicions, Lola's parents, Adriana and Diego, trust the evidence presented by the police, agree that 2 suspects were involved in the crime, and hope for a swift verdict. Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police. But the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action. So she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there, with whom. The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time, the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth, but in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Pitești. But Pitești is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Pitești, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone.
But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Stephen. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment, where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Stephen's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children, Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori. So 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Stephen and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death, as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Stephen, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Stephen realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Stephen took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, for 2 years Stephen worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Stephen was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women, but a woman can only have one husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Stephen. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle. But she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Stephen made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Steven Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula, but instead of destroying the copy, She put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything. The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy, to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home. Her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her Uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her, but Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Alinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus, in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her, but it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Olinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Selindon, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet, even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions. Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed, and the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry. As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted. introduced himself by another name and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Maël gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Maël, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Maël left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Maël, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter and they liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story. The Bermuda Islands are a British territory in the western part of the Atlantic Ocean, located about 1,000 kilometers away from the coast of the USA. It is not a country in the traditional sense, nor is it a state with a developing economy. The Bermuda Islands can boast one of the highest per capita income levels in the world. The country takes pride in its safety for travelers, stunning beaches with pink sand and golf courses. Thanks to these attractions, it annually attracts 500,000 tourists, primarily from the USA. With a small population and low crime rates, local newspapers have always written about tourism and local entertainment, but only until the summer of 1996, when the world was shocked by the murder of a young tourist from Canada, and the subsequent injustice cast a shadow over the idyllic islands. In June 1996, 16-year-old Rebecca Middleton from Belleville, Canada, graduated from the 11th grade with top grades as she had worked hard for it. Rebecca, or Becky, was the youngest daughter of David and Cindy Middleton, who had separated when she was 13 years old. Fortunately, her parents had divorced amicably, and the children enjoyed spending time with both their father and mother. Being an active girl, Rebecca had a passion for water sports, loved sailing, and was involved in windsurfing. She loved spending time with friends, but always remembered the boundaries she shouldn't cross. In general, one could say that many parents dream of having such a daughter, cheerful, active, full of life, yet responsible. This is precisely why David and Cindy reluctantly allowed Rebecca to fly to the Bermuda Islands with her best friend, Jasmine Means. Jasmine's father, Rick Means, lived on the main island, and the girls were supposed to stay at his house and be under his care throughout the vacation. Nevertheless, it took a year of negotiations and communication between the parents over the phone before Cindy and David were convinced that they could let their daughter go so far. However, Becky's parents had no significant reasons to worry. Bermuda had traditionally been considered the safest place for a vacation. On June 20th, 1996, Becky and Jasmine set off for a 6-week vacation. It was a dream journey, and for the first 2 weeks, the girls thoroughly enjoyed it. How could it be otherwise? Picturesque islands surrounded by crystal-clear ocean waters that invited exploration. And then there were endless opportunities to sunbathe on the beach with its astonishing pink sand. On June 27th, Becky celebrated her 17th birthday far from her family. However, Jasmine, Rick, and his wife Lynn ordered a beautiful cake and made every effort to ensure that the celebration would be unforgettable for the guests. During their vacation, the girls met 3 young men from the UK, also visiting for the summer: Russell McCann, Ben Turtle, and Jonathan Cassidy, whose father was a police officer who had been transferred to the island from Britain. On July 2, 1996, it was Russell's turn to celebrate his birthday. The young group had planned to arrive by boat, but the weather interfered with their plans, and due to the rain, they had to abandon that idea. At the last moment, they decided to go to a pub. To celebrate Russell's birthday, the young people chose the oldest and most respected pub, which also happened to be a seafood restaurant. On the Bermuda Islands, alcoholic beverages could be ordered starting from the age of 18. Nevertheless, the girls had a few glasses of beer and cocktails. After leaving the pub, the young people decided to take a walk to their friend's house in the town of St. George's to the east of the main island. They spent some time at their friend's house, but when it was time to return home, the girls were slightly delayed, and they missed the time when they should have called Rick to pick them up. Moreover, Becky and Jasmine had had a few drinks and were worried that Rick would be upset. That's why, at 1:08, the girls called a taxi and went to wait for it on the street. When the taxi didn't show up by 1:45, the girls returned to their friend's house and called the taxi service again. The operator told them that the taxi had come, but the driver hadn't seen them, so he had left. After waiting on the street for another half hour, Jasmine and Becky called again at 2:16 in the morning. Jonathan Cassidy waited with them for a while, but decided to go inside the house and go to sleep. He left them waiting for the taxi, being confident that the taxi would arrive soon. Perhaps he thought they could return to the house and knock. The other guys were already asleep. By this time, dawn was approaching, and the girls were getting nervous. They were sure that Rick would scold them when they got home. In reality, Rick wasn't too angry or extremely concerned. After all, it was not unusual for teenagers to lose track of time while celebrating a birthday, and it was hard for him to imagine that anything could happen in a place as safe as Bermuda. It never crossed his mind that something might go wrong. While Jasmine and Rebecca were standing on the street, the lights in their friend's house went out, signaling that everyone had gone to sleep and it would be inconvenient to knock on their door again. At this moment, a local acquaintance of theirs, 21-year-old Dean Lattimore, arrived on a motorcycle. He asked them if they needed a taxi, to which the girls replied that they had already called one and were waiting for it to arrive. They had only talked for about 2 minutes when another motorcycle approached from the opposite direction, carrying 2 local guys. They seemed to recognize Dean and gave him a nod of greeting. The young men asked the girls what they were doing on the street at that time in a small town where they obviously weren't locals. The motorcycle driver showed a clear interest in Rebecca and complimented her on the necklace that Jasmine had given her. The guys assured the girls that the taxi wouldn't come, and they offered to give them a ride. Jasmine reasoned that they didn't have helmets, and they didn't want any trouble because of it. The guys replied that they had 1 spare helmet. Another one was found with Dean. Honestly, Rebecca and Jasmine didn't want to get on the motorcycle with unfamiliar guys, but it was clear they had no better option. Mobile phones weren't common at the time. There were no nearby payphones,
and the buses wouldn't start running for several hours, and the taxi still hadn't arrived. What choice did they have? Of course, they could have woken up their friends and called Jasmine's dad, but the girls dismissed that idea. Since Jasmine was slightly bigger in build than Rebecca, she sat on Dean's motorcycle, and Rebecca sat on the other motorcycle between the two guys. All of them set off. The guy's motorcycle with Rebecca on it was in front, and Dean and Jasmine followed behind. Jasmine had asked Dean not to rush, and he carefully drove her. As a result, the guys on the other motorcycle quickly distanced themselves. At the bridge, Dean chose a shorter route, and around 2:30 in the morning, Jasmine was already home. She was surprised that her friends were not there yet, as Rebecca should have arrived before her. The spare key was in its place by the door, and the door to the house was locked. With growing anxiety, Jasmine waited for Rebecca. Finally, unable to wait any longer, she went to her dad and said that she had lost Rebecca. Rick couldn't understand how the girls could have separated, but he got in the car, and they began to look for Rebecca. Jasmine was too scared to admit to her dad that her friend had gotten on the motorcycle with two completely unfamiliar guys. She only said that she had last seen her on the bridge. While Jasmine and her father were looking for Rebecca near the bridge where Jasmine had last seen her, about 13 kilometers away, 4 friends were driving along Ferry Reach Road after a pleasant evening. Dana Rollins, a club DJ, was behind the wheel. Suddenly, the car's headlights caught sight of a figure lying in the darkness on the road. Dana got out of the car and cautiously approached. He saw that it was a young girl, a teenager. She was partially undressed, lying with her back to the car, curled up in a ball. The girl was covered in blood, and it appeared that she had been attacked before she managed to crawl to the road. She couldn't speak due to a deep wound on her throat, but attempted to say something. Dana tried to stop the bleeding and encouraged the girl to hold on and save her energy for help. At the same time, his friends drove to the nearest payphone to call for an ambulance, while Jasmine and her father were searching for Rebecca at the bridge, where Jasmine last saw her. An ambulance sped past them. Jasmine sensed that the ambulance was going to pick up Rebecca and told her father so. However, Rick cut his daughter off, not allowing her to even think that something bad could have happened. The ambulance arrived fairly quickly, but was still late. The medics couldn't do anything to help Rebecca. When Rick and Jasmine returned home, the sun had risen. Rick immediately called the police to report Rebecca's disappearance. The responding officer informed him that they would have to wait for 24 hours before they could file a missing person report. Rick argued with the officer, trying to convince him that Rebecca could not have simply gone somewhere when she suddenly received word that he was placed on hold. When the officer returned to the call, he asked Rick to come to Ferry Reach Road. Rick inquired if they had found Becky, but the only response he received was, "Go to the bridge." In frustration, Rick hung up the phone, and he and his daughter drove to the indicated location. Even from a distance, they spotted numerous police cars and officers, clearly working at a crime scene. Rick got out of the car and asked his daughter to wait for him. He didn't want her to see what he feared he would find beyond the police barricade. Approaching the scene, Rick noticed a body bag. Investigators unzipped the bag and asked him if he could identify the person inside. Rick admitted that Rebecca had been so severely injured and had lost so much blood that he had to look a second time before he could tell the investigators that it was her. He attempted to embrace her, but the police officers pulled him away. Hysterics overcame him, and he cried out in pain and despair, striking the police van in disbelief. Jasmine, who was still sitting in the car, heard her father's screams and realized that Rebecca was no more. On the way back home, both father and daughter were in a deeply sorrowful state. Rick didn't know how to tell Rebecca's parents that their daughter was dead, not just dead, but brutally murdered. How could he tell them that he hadn't protected their daughter, whom he had promised to take care of? Having given Rick the opportunity to inform Rebecca's family, the investigators wanted to speak with him and his daughter. It's difficult to imagine the horror that overcame Rick when Jasmine informed the police that Rebecca had gotten on a motorcycle with 2 strangers. This was the first time he had heard of it. Jasmine didn't know their names, only that they were 2 young men on a motorcycle, a description that could fit many local men. She knew Dean, the one who had driven her home, but not the other 2. The brutal murder of a young Canadian tourist on Bermuda, a place heavily dependent on tourism, could have had a significant impact on the country's economy. Therefore, there would have been immense pressure on the investigators to solve the case as quickly as possible. However, the inexperience of many of the investigators as well as potential breaches of standard police procedures, complicated the collection of evidence. Nevertheless, they managed to gather evidence at the crime scene. Rebecca's bustier had been cut from her shoulders, and her skirt was torn in the front. The necklace that had caught the attention of the men was nowhere to be found, possibly taken by the perpetrators as a souvenir. Typically, in cases of suspicious deaths in Bermuda, an autopsy is conducted by an outside expert. However, in this case, the autopsy was performed by a local hospital pathologist who openly acknowledged a potential lack of skills and experience for such work. Still, the authorities pushed for haste, and he concluded that Rebecca had been subjected to brutal violence before her death, suffering deep wounds that affected vital organs, including the neck wound, which led to her demise due to shock and severe bleeding. 4 men who found Rebecca's body were questioned and quickly ruled out as suspects. The police promised Rebecca's parents to find her killer as soon as possible and devoted all their efforts to the search, investigating local young men with legal troubles. After that, they invited Dean for identification, but even here, they deviated from the standard police procedure. There was no two-way mirror or opaque barrier between Dean and the suspects, nothing that would allow the witness's identity to remain hidden. What was even more horrifying was that Dean recognized one of the guys who had driven Becky, but he knew how dangerous and vengeful that person was. He was afraid for his family, his son, and ultimately for his own life, so he claimed that the guys were wearing helmets and he didn't see their faces. Following the unsuccessful identification, the police, in a hurry to apprehend the culprits, offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the criminals. They continued to interrogate potential suspects when a breakthrough occurred on July 9th, 6 days after the crime. Dean decided that what had happened was too terrible to let the killers escape punishment, and, despite his fear, he provided the investigators with the names of the guys who had approached the girls on a motorcycle that evening. They were 21-year-old Jamaican native Kirk Mundy and 17-year-old Justice Smith. Kirk had just been released from prison on bail awaiting trial for a bank robbery case. Justice Smith came from a decent family but had dropped out of school and was getting into trouble after associating with Kirk. The guys were arrested and charged with Rebecca's murder. In Bermuda, 17-year-old Justice could be tried as an adult, so they faced the highest possible punishment if convicted. Shortly after that, another witness contacted the police. He explained that he and a friend had a breakdown near the crime scene. While they were waiting for assistance, Justice and Kirk pulled over to chat with them. The witness stated that Kirk appeared unusually disheveled, and there was blood on his shirt. Nevertheless, Kirk and Justice continued to deny any involvement and insisted that they were nowhere near that road. Justice claimed they were at a nightclub, while Kirk stated that he was at home with his girlfriend, who was expecting a child. The police collected DNA samples from the two and sent them to a laboratory in Canada for testing. While awaiting the test results, another witness emerged, having seen the 2 guys on the motorcycle at 3:20 in the morning. He noticed that a white piece of fabric covered the motorcycle's registration number. Interestingly, the white vest that Rebecca was wearing that evening was never found. Kirk Mundy knew that he was facing a serious charge for murder. Understanding that he was linked to the crime scene and that his DNA was being analyzed, he requested a meeting with a lawyer. The lawyer directly told him that if his DNA matched the semen found on the girl, his alibi of being at home would be completely disproven. In response, Kirk decided to provide a statement to the prosecutor, admitting that he had assaulted the girl and that Eustace had killed her, making him an involuntary accomplice to the crime. Kirk revealed that he had thrown the knife, used in the murder, into the water from a bridge. The prosecutor's office, under immense pressure to solve the case, quickly struck a deal with Kirk before waiting for the DNA test results in exchange for his testimony against Eustace. In court, Kirk apologized before being sentenced to 5 years in prison for his involvement in the crime. The remarkably lenient sentence deeply upset Rebecca's parents, but their nightmare was far from over. Just 2 days after this sentence, the results of the DNA comparison arrived. Justice Smith's DNA was not found at the crime scene. Only Kirk Mundy's DNA was present. Kirk had humiliated the girl and at the very least had participated in her murder. Kirk had outwitted the prosecutor, the police, and probably his own lawyer, as they all believed him. The prosecutor confronted Kirk, demanding an explanation for how his DNA ended up on the girl. Kirk claimed that as they were riding on the motorcycle, Rebecca whispered that she was willing to be intimate with him,
After he fulfilled her wish, he claimed he walked to the water to wash up when he suddenly heard Rebecca scream, "No!" He rushed back, and it appeared as though Eustace was striking her in the face. However, a few seconds later, he noticed that she was bleeding from her throat. They quickly fled on the motorcycle. The prosecutor did not believe a word of Kirk's story and attempted to accuse him of intentionally murdering Rebecca, but it was too late. By law, a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Kirk slipped through the prosecutor's fingers. The prosecutors decided to at least seek justice in the case against Justice Smith. There was no sign of his semen on Rebecca, possibly because he used a condom. 2 condom wrappers were found near the crime scene, but such evidence wouldn't be admissible in court. Therefore, the most crucial piece of evidence became the knife, approximately 10 centimeters long with a broad blade, that the culprits had discarded from the bridge. The prosecution called on renowned American pathologist Michael Baden to examine it, who also re-examined the autopsy results. He explained that when a serrated knife makes contact with skin, it leaves markings as unique as fingerprints. The wounds on Rebecca's body matched the knife found under the bridge. In Justice's home, a set of relatively rare knives from the same manufacturer as the murder weapon was discovered, missing 1 knife. The evidence continued to mount, but proving anything was difficult because the initial autopsy had been conducted with errors. For instance, the body had been washed before the examination was completed. Additionally, no skin samples from the attacker's nails were taken from Rebecca. These samples could have revealed who she had struggled with before her death: Kirk, Justice, or both. However, based on his experience, the pathologist concluded that the person responsible for her death was not acting alone. The pathologist's analysis indicated that before Rebecca's murder, she had suffered shallow but highly distressing and emotionally intimidating wounds, which he referred to as Jamaican torture. The distinct edges of these wounds and the absence of cuts on the girl's hands suggested that one assailant held her head and arms behind her, while the other used the serrated knife to scratch and cut her forehead. She was on her knees at the time, and her tormentor loomed over her. The pathologist believed that these torturous wounds were meant to coerce the girl into doing things during the attack that she had initially resisted. After the attacker obtained what he wanted, he slashed her throat with the knife. Rebecca died within minutes, and due to her internal injuries, she wouldn't have been able to make it to the road by herself. Again, 2 people had to carry her. The bruises on her wrists and smudges on her boots pointed clearly to 2 individuals. After this ordeal, the perpetrators left her to die from blood loss. In November 1998, the trial of Justice Smith began, and his parents hired a lawyer from Britain to defend their son. Suddenly, a week before the trial, the lead prosecutor left the Bermuda Islands, and his replacement had little time to prepare for the trial. Complicating matters, all the evidence against Eustace was circumstantial. Nevertheless, the evidence appeared to be quite reliable. The last time Rebecca was seen, Kirk and Justice were taking her on a motorcycle, and they were identified by Dean. Witnesses connected the guys to the crime scene. The pathologist clearly stated that 2 individuals were involved in the crime. The murder weapon matched a set of knives in Eustace's kitchen. Shouldn't that have been enough? After the prosecution finished presenting the case, Eustace's lawyer didn't call a single witness. He simply argued that there was no semen, hair, fiber, or blood that could link Eustace to the murder or violence, and thus the case against him should be dismissed, and the jury should be discharged. Nobody expected what would happen next. Out of the blue, the news broke that the judge had agreed with the defense's arguments and was discharging the jury. Justice Smith walked out of the courtroom as a free man. Rebecca's parents were in shock. Cindy rushed out of the courtroom and David sat there, unable to move. Many in the courtroom were brought to tears by the injustice. Naturally, the prosecutor filed an appeal, arguing that the judge had not considered the circumstantial evidence, which was substantial. The Bermuda Court of Appeal ordered a new trial for Justice, but this decision was challenged in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council of the United Kingdom, acting as the country's highest court. They ruled that Justice could not be tried a second time for the same offense. Their decision was final, putting an end to any further appeals. In 2002, Justice Smith attacked 2 women with a knife, injuring one of them. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but the judge released him, considering the time he had already spent in custody. Kirk Mundy served 20 years in prison for a robbery he was initially charged with before Rebecca's murder and for weapons possession. Upon his release, he was deported to Jamaica. Since nobody faced punishment for Rebecca's murder, the nightmare for her family continued. They deserved more. Every day, her family would come to the courthouse, hoping and waiting for justice. In the following years, Rebecca's family desperately sought justice for their daughter. They made several attempts to reopen the case, but in 2008, David announced that he could no longer financially support the battle against Bermuda's legal system. Ironically, 10 years after the murder, the government of the island compensated the Middleton family for the pain and suffering they endured, cutting a check for $2,840.